Have you ever wondered why you can't remember your traumatic childhood? Have you ever remembered something in fragments, but you couldn't remember the context or the full situation or the scenario? Well, in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the anatomy of flashbacks. You know, flashbacks are pretty interesting because really what they're fragments of situations that have happened in the past that is traumatic to you. And those fragments kind of come together in these skewed ways. And it's difficult for sufferers of flashbacks to put the pieces together. And it's just like walking through a movie and, you know, you are seeing some of the actors, you're hearing some of the sounds, you're smelling some of the smells, and maybe you're even feeling some of the sensations. But it's not easy for you to determine where you are, what time of day it was. You might even find yourself confused about whether it happened at all. But before we get into that, let me briefly introduce myself. In case you are new, my name is Tamara, and I'm an internationally and board certified trauma therapist. I'm also licensed in mental health, and I specialize in treating children, teens, and families, as well as adults who are dealing with trauma. Let's jump in. Anytime I introduce neuroscience on this channel, I really try to make it as plain and practical and self-explanatory as I can. And it's not because you guys can't understand it. It's because I think for the most part, neuroscience is complex. The brain is complex. And so if we're confused and we study this and we hear the terms all the time, it has to be a little bit complicated for you as well. So I try to make sure that videos like this are self-explanatory or practical. So I'm going to do my best in this video to make sure that you understand the anatomy of flashbacks. So at the beginning of the video, I did kind of explain to you already what a flashback is, but I want to give you a little bit more detail. So a flashback, if you were to look it up online or if you were to, find some kind of detailed definition, is really a vivid involuntary memory that enters consciousness involuntarily. So you don't just snap your finger and boom, you can remember, right? It's not like you can go to a place where the trauma happened and boom, it's going to pop up. Sometimes it's very involuntary and it's really hard to figure out when it's going to hit you, when it's going to come up, and when you're going to feel all the sensations and emotions that comes along with that flashback. So they are vivid, I'll call them involuntary memories that kind of seeps into consciousness when you least expect it. Like I said at the beginning of the video, you may find yourself really being confused and perplexed about the time of day or where this happened or how it happened. You may get bits and pieces, almost like, I'm going to say, for example, taking a granola bar and, pounding on it until it breaks apart in these little bits and pieces. The bits and pieces of the granola bar, they don't come out evenly, right? There's some little pieces, there's some bigger chunks, there's some medium chunks, and that's basically how flashbacks are. They don't seem to pop into your awareness in an organized fashion, and you may only remember bits and pieces of the traumatic experience, right? So you may only remember maybe 5 minutes before the trauma or 5 minutes after the trauma. And even though you want to remember sometimes, there are some people who want to really remember for legal purposes, for healing and trauma work. They really want to remember, but they can't, right? So no matter how much you want to remember, it might be difficult for you to. You may only have fragments and bits and pieces of that traumatic situation come back to you. What actually happens here? Well, there's quite a few things that happens here. There's emotional distress that goes along with the flashback being triggered, but then there's also the re-experiencing of the event when it is triggered. So you've got those two components, right? You've got the emotional distress because you're remembering something that's traumatic. And again, you may only remember bits and pieces of it, but then you also have the re-experiencing of the event, and that can cause increased heart rate. It can cause, racing memories. It can also cause things like depression and anxiety, sometimes anger, and sometimes impulsivity and inattention, right? Because these are involuntary memories of the trauma that's seeping into your consciousness. And so it may derail you in a lot of ways. So there's a couple of parts of the brain that I want you to be aware of. One part of the brain is known as the amygdala, and I always talk about that on this channel. It's an almond-sized structure in the brain that really is the seat of our consciousness when it comes to emotions. And what happens here is, the amygdala takes the emotions out of every situation and it stores it for later use. So emotional memories, traumatic memories, sad memories, happy memories, frustrating memories, all that is in the area of the amygdala and the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus, which I'm going to post a picture right up here for you so that you can see it, the hippocampus is basically a part of the brain that stores our memories. And, it really takes cues from the amygdala. So when the amygdala kind of cements an emotional experience that we have, the hippocampus takes that and stores the memory. And so they actually work together in partnership. It's really important for the hippocampus and the amygdala to work together to create those memories for us. But if we have a traumatic situation that happens to us and we're experiencing a flashback, what happens is the amygdala begins to almost put you in a state of fight or flight mode again, central nervous system dominance. When your heart rate goes up, your mind may be racing, you may be, on the verge of crying or shutting down, you may be shaking, you may even be having a panic attack, right? Some people even go into having a heart attack, or, they really, shake and cry and they scream and they shut down. They just completely give up. That is the amygdala. It's really causing the person to re-experience what they experienced at the moment of the trauma. Now, the hippocampus takes that information and says, okay, well, we're back in the traumatic situation, and boom, there's a flashback, right? So something triggers the hippocampus, something triggers the amygdala. As I talk about right up here in this video, I talk a lot about the amygdala almost being like a flashlight, and it kind of searches out things in a way where it can detect a threat. And there's no higher order processes here. In other words, there's no executive functioning here. There's no logical reasoning. It's all emotions. And so really what it's doing is the amygdala is almost like a guard dog. It's kind of guarding you, and it's looking for triggers and cues that it's in danger. Once it finds what it's looking for, then it begins to react to the environment. And sometimes it's reacting when it doesn't need to react, Now, the hippocampus works to create those flashbacks and kind of pulls those memories back into our consciousness. And it also reminds us of the associations that we create with that emotional traumatic experience, So these two parts of the brain is really a team, and they work together to create those flashbacks. Now, another thing that I want you to keep in mind is that the amygdala basically has increased activity when you are experiencing a flashback. So that's why when you are experiencing a flashback, you may start to have increased heart rate, you may start to feel fear and even anxiety. And that's because there's increased activity in the amygdala. Now, there's decreased activity in the hippocampus, and that means that it can really be difficult for the brain to understand that, okay, wait a minute, we're not in the traumatic situation that happened to me a couple years ago. We're actually in the here and the now. So here's what happens. The hippocampus really does give the amygdala context. The amygdala is like that guard dog. It's a flashlight. It looks for triggers. It looks for danger. The hippocampus basically says this: look, amygdala, we are in this particular situation at this particular time. It gives the context. But when you are having a flashback and your body is going through that same emotional experience that it went through when you were experiencing the trauma, the hippocampus is unable to give you that context. The hippocampus has decreased activity when you're having a flashback, and that means that it's unable to give you some kind of awareness that you're not in that traumatic situation. So if the hippocampus could give us context, we wouldn't have necessarily the experience of trauma again. We wouldn't re-experience trauma because the hippocampus would snap to it and say, hey there, we're no longer in that traumatic situation. But because the hippocampus cannot give us that context, right? Somewhere our brain thinks we're back in that traumatic experience. I hope that makes sense. And that's because there's decreased activity in the hippocampus when you're having a flashback. So here's what's likely to happen. And I just want you to understand this so that you'll know what's happening to you when it's happening, okay? The first thing that's likely to happen is that you may experience a memory in fragments. So when the amygdala and the hippocampus are trying to work together during a flashback, you may find that you're not getting any clarity. You're not able to say to yourself, I am not back there, right? So when that happens, your body is going to go through fight or flight mode, central nervous system dominance, right? Your body is reacting, your amygdala is sensing some kind of fear and danger, some kind of threat, and then you begin to experience that flashback, and it may come in fragments, okay? The next thing is that you may experience panic attacks and anxiety because, again, the hippocampus has decreased electrical activity in there, and it's really difficult for it to provide you with that context so you'll know that you're not back there where you used to be. The next thing is that, flashbacks may not happen all the time. You may have them 3 times in 1 year, and then somehow later on down the road, have them again. And it could be 5 years later, it could be 6 years later. Maybe you've gone 15 years without flashbacks, and all of a sudden it comes back. Flashbacks are really difficult to pinpoint, and sometimes we don't know all the triggers to our flashbacks too. And that's what makes it even more difficult to pinpoint, when am I going to have a flashback? The last thing that I want you to keep in mind is that you may have nightmares, and those nightmares come up because the amygdala is sensing some kind of danger, some kind of threat, and the hippocampus is unable to give you that context. And so a nightmare may happen as well. Sometimes if you don't have flashbacks, you'll have nightmares in its place. I'm going to come back to this, guys. I think this is a very important topic. I also think that this is something that can help you understand what's happening to yourself when you're in the middle of a flashback. Thank you so much for being with me today, guys. I encourage you to give this video a thumbs up and go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you want to stick around with us, and I will see you in the next video. We're going to keep talking about this. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.